I'd like to tell you a story, and I think many people know the story, and maybe you even like the story. But by the time we finish with it, you may no longer like the story. So there's a story that is told by Chazal about Adam Harishon, that Hashem showed Adam Harishon every single person who was going to live until the end of time. You've heard this?
Yes.
And one of the people that he saw was King David. And what did he see when Hashem showed him King David? That he would be a stillborn. Right? He would be a stillborn. And so as a result of that, Adam Harishon donated 70 years of his life to David HaMelech. And that's how David HaMelech lived. You've heard the story before? Okay, so my question on the story is, I'm sorry, but the story makes absolutely no sense. Makes absolutely no sense. In other words, let's unpack this. From Hashem's point of view, did Hashem want David to be a stillborn, or did Hashem want David to live?
To be a king.
Both. See, now there's a Jewish answer. See, both. Okay, so if Hashem did not want David to be a stillborn, why is it that when Adam looked at him, he saw that he was going to be a stillborn?
No.
Clearly his destiny was that he was going to be a stillborn. Otherwise, when again, Hashem showed Adam every single generation, right until the end of time, every single person who was going to be born. So one of the people that he showed him was David, and he showed him David as a stillborn. That implies that his destiny was to be a stillborn. And then Adam donates 70 years of his life. And as a result of that, David HaMelech lives for 70 years. So now my question is, does that mean that Adam Harishon was able to override Hashem's plan? Because Hashem's plan was that David is going to be a stillborn. And then Adam came along and he decided he's going to mess with that and he's going to donate 70 years. Does that make sense? I'll take it a step further. How do you donate life to anybody? How does that work? It's not yours to give. Exactly. In other words, if he did donate 70 years to David, and therefore David lived for 70 years, that means that's what Hashem wanted. So then I go back to the questions. If that's what Hashem wanted, why did he appear to be a stillborn? Whichever way you look at the story, it seems to make no sense. So, what mitzvah? Of giving 70 years of his life. Okay. Okay, that's fine.
At the end of our lives, hopefully is very different from the beginning of our life. Yet
Of course. But you have to first be able to live. If somebody's destined to be a stillborn, they don't have that opportunity. They're not given the chance to establish themselves. So it's a very strange story. Whichever way you look at it, it's a very strange story. Okay, so let's go. Let's. Yeah, that's unfortunately not going to help us understand the story. So the question is now, when we spoke about Chesed, we immediately identified who the person of Chesed is. That was easy. That was Avraham, right? And the same with Yitzchak, that was easy. Last week was a little bit more of a push to work out the connection between Yosef and Yesod. But it should be fairly easy for us to understand that David HaMelech, who is the first of the proper kings, and therefore is the father of the lineage of Jewish kings, so he would be the person who represents Malchus. And that's where we are. We're at the final Sphira, the 10th of 10 Sephiros, which is called the Sphira of Malchus. And if we want to understand it, we have to understand this story of David HaMelech. We have to understand other stories of David HaMelech as well, but we have to understand this story of David HaMelech specifically in order to understand what Malchus is. So before we can unpack the story, we have to just try and identify in our own experience. Remember, everything we're learning over here, we're looking at from two perspectives. How it is in our experience and how it is in the divine experience. Because obviously the 10 Sephiros are the divine system, and that system is then reflected in us. So we see how things play out in our lives, but we use that as a means to understand how things are in the higher realms. So this element of Malchus, which is the last of the 10 Sephiros, that's very significant. Why would it be the last? What's the relevance of being the last? And so what we've got to do is we've got to understand what it relates to, just in terms of the human anatomy, the human experience, and from that to be able to work it out how it relates to the divine. So in order to do that, let's talk about a king for a second. It's difficult for us to relate to a king with any level of seriousness because, unfortunately, the monarchs that we have in today's world, they're the fodder of glossy tabloid magazines. You know, they're not really monarchs in the real sense of the word. So it is a little difficult for us to relate to this idea of a monarch. But anyhow, let's try. Let's try and understand the concept of a monarch because it will help us to understand where we're going with this aspect of Malchus. So when you think of a king, what are the adjectives that you immediately associate with a king? What are the behaviors that you associate with the king? What are the characteristics that you associate with the king? And most importantly, what is the relationship between the king and the people? Okay, so those are the things we have to understand because if we're talking over here about Malchus directly translates as royalty. And we've got to understand what that is. And by the way, when we're going to speak about ourselves, it's very difficult to say that we have a characteristic of royalty. That doesn't seem to make any sense. So let's unpack what a king is, what a king does, how a king behaves. From that, we'll be able to come back and understand what the concept of Malchus is, and then understand how it works in the higher realms and how it works in our realm, in our own lives. So what are the things that you'd associate with a king? Justice, hopefully.
Regal.
Hopefully. Regal is really just saying that they are a king, right? So what do you mean by that? Let's unpack what you mean by that. When you say, they're not necessarily omnipotent, but you could say powerful, right? They have a lot of power, possibly absolute power. Okay, so similar to so justice, right? That there's an aspect of morality and justice that is associated with the king. Do you have to be a king in order to be moral and in order to have justice? No. So it's not something which is unique to a king. It's one of the things that they're supposed to represent. It's not necessarily their very unique characteristic. Whereas power is, right? Power is very much the attribute of the king is to have power. Okay, what else? Okay, one second. Let's go one at a time. So independence. What do you mean by independence?
His own judgments, independent of
So
what he's represented with.
okay, so is a king allowed to legally in Torah law make independent judgments? He's beholden to the Sanhedrin, so he doesn't have that. That's what keeps a king in check. So he can't just make his own rulings. Although there is something called Gezeras HaMelech, that he does have certain authority to be able to make certain decrees. For example, he can expropriate land without compensation. Don't tell anybody that, right? But he can, and he can execute people if there's a crime wave. Then he can use his executive function to be able to prosecute outside of the court. So he does have a certain amount of independence. That's true. Now, humility is very interesting. Do people naturally associate humility with the king?
No.
In Torah, we do. Yes, in Torah, we do. And that's what distinguishes a king from, in Judaism, from how a king is in other settings, in other civilizations, where very often the king was actually quite a pompous individual. And for us, as Jewish people, one of the key things, if you want to be the king, is you have to be exceedingly humble. Not just humble, you have to be exceedingly humble. Hold that thought. It's a very, very important part of this conversation, is the humility of the king. What else would you associate with the king?
They believe that the king is ordained by
Ah, divine right of kings, right? Divine right of kings. And it's not only the Brits, there are various royal families who believe in the divine rights of kings, that if you are the king, it's because it's ordained by God. And we have something similar, because it's not entirely the same. For example, the Rambam tells us that to be the king is an inherited position, and the person has to be suitable. So they have to be independently seen to be suitable. But the lineage is a divinely ordained lineage. So we have that aspect as well. And that would lead into humility too, because if a person recognizes that their position is divinely ordained, rather the achievement of their talents, etc., that will keep them humble. Okay, so we've got a nice package over here, nice perspective on what the king is. Let's talk for a moment about the relationship between the king and the people. What kind of a relationship do you anticipate between the citizens and the king? They have to respect. They have to be in awe of the king. They have to respect the king. They have to obey. That's probably the key thing, is that as a subject, you have to obey the king. That's the key part of your relationship. What else? Do you expect any level of closeness? Right, you've got to accept the king, so that's obey, right? You've got to accept the authority of the king, and without that, there is no king to speak of. Does the king have to love his people?
Well, Moshe Rabbeinu, that was his biggest thing.
Fine, Moshe is like the shepherd, etc. True. and David HaMelech was also chosen because he was a shepherd who cared so carefully for the different sheep and how the different ages needed to be fed in different ways, and he was very conscious about the needs of the individual sheep.
Also after Shlomo, that his son was, Yerovam was harsh with the people and that's how the kingdom.
Yeah, okay, true. That was also because he had bad advice. So one of the key things about a king is going back to the point that he doesn't make independent decisions, that he should defer to the Sanhedrin, and Rechavam didn't. He had his little cabal of advisors who tried to push a hard line, and it didn't work. So that's true. So he's got to be compassionate. It's not love. He has to be compassionate to the people. It's a very important thing that the king has to be compassionate to the people. Okay, so let me ask you this. If you're an average citizen in a kingdom, what is the likelihood that you will ever interact personally with the king? Zero. That's the whole reason we make such a big deal in the month of Elul about the king in the field, because that's so unusual. But typically, nobody gets to engage with the king. So here's the very, very big question. What makes a relationship between the subjects and the king? If they're not going to interact personally, the likelihood is that 90%, even more, 99% of the subjects will never actually see the king up close. They'll probably see him, from a distance, standing on his big balcony, making a State of the Nation address or something like that. But yes, the royal wave, exactly. They're not going to have a personal, close connection. So what creates the connection between the king and the subjects? Loyalty, good. So from the subject's perspective, their loyalty to the king creates their relationship with the king. Great. How do they show that loyalty? They what? Obedience, right? Good. So in order to show loyalty to the king, you obviously have to obey the king. So therefore, from the people's perspective, the relationship is built on obedience and loyalty. From the king's perspective, what's the relationship built on? That's the people's side, right? The people have to serve the king. So that tells us what we, as the subjects, have to do in order to have a relationship with the king. What does the king have to do in order to have a relationship with the subjects? He doesn't have to be compassionate. It's ideal that he should be compassionate, but he doesn't have to be compassionate. He has to be fair, that's true, but that doesn't necessarily create a relationship. In other words, if there's no reason to engage with a particular group of people, then I don't have to be fair. In other words, I can be fair generically as the king to the whole nation. What creates relationship between the king and the people? If you're saying that the people's relationship with the king is obedience and loyalty, so then surely the flip side has to be something that the king is doing in that same continuum. Okay, responsibility.
And some benefits.
Does there have to be benefit to the people? Ideally there should, right? Ideally, we want a benevolent monarch. That's what we want. The ideal state in Judaism is a benevolent monarch who actually has the interests of the people at heart. But that doesn't breed loyalty, right? In fact, to the contrary, if he's overly benevolent, he might breed entitlement or maybe even anarchy if the people feel that he's a weak king. So what's the key? Where's the point of contact between the king and the people? It's fascinating. Where is the point of contact between the king and the people? The laws, there we go, the laws that he makes. In other words, if we're going to show our relationship to the king through loyalty and obedience, then from the king's perspective, he has to give us things to be obedient to. So from the king's perspective, the relationship is made from instruction, which we're going to call laws or decrees. A decree is very much a royal edict, right? That's very much the language that you use with regards to a king. So the king is going to give an edict, and based on that, we're going to then be loyal subjects and follow the thing that the king said. And it might be something which is completely irrational to us. So the king could, for example, say that on a Monday, you have to walk on the right-hand side of the road and you can't walk on the left-hand side of the road. And then we just have to obey because that's going to show our relationship. So that tells you which part of the king engages the people. Is it his head? So do we know what's going on in his head? If he makes an edict and we don't understand it, have we gotten into his head? We haven't gotten into his head, right? So what is the point of contact between the king and the people? His mouth, his words. Bidvar melech shilton. That's what the pasuk says. Bidvar melech, with the word of the king, shilton is his authority. So the king's relationship with the people is with his mouth. Therefore, we understand that malchus is associated with the mouth. In Tikkunei Zohar, it says that malchus peh. Malchus corresponds to the mouth. Now, up until now, the whole anatomical association with the spheros actually made sense, because you could see that the head is at the top, and that's where Chochmah, Bina, and Da'as are, and then you could see that the vital organs are in the torso area, and that represents Ahava and Yira, and then we spoke about Netzach and Hod being the supports to the body. It all kind of made sense. And now when we get to Malchus, you don't think of the mouth as the lowest part of the body, and yet we're at the lowest point of the spheros. So how do you link that? How could you say that the mouth becomes a representation of the lowest part of the body?
Because, I don't know, but if the king is going to tell you what to do and you don't agree, you're just going to act. You know?
Good, 100%. So how does that show you it's the lowest part? I'm agreeing 100% with what you're saying. How does it show you that that's the lowest part of the body, the lowest part of the human, the lowest part of the king in this particular case? Okay, so let's think of it this way. There are two things you have to bear in mind. When we say the lowest part, we don't mean just in the structure of what the body looks like. Yes, Hashem has designed us that we walk upright, and therefore and this is key information, our entire personal system is a hierarchy that is reflected in the hierarchy of the human anatomy. So the greatest parts of the system are at the top, and the less developed parts of the system are lower down. That's useful for understanding our system. But actually the lowest part of a person is where the person is able to escape themselves, to step out of themselves. That's the lowest part of the person. Meaning, this is the part I can give away. This is the part that isn't critical in order for me to be me. I can't share something that's critical for my survival. Right? A person, as much as people say, that I gave him my heart. People use that kind of language. But the reality is, you don't actually give away something that is vital to your own survival. But words you give away freely. That's what words are for. Words are for public distribution. So therefore the mouth that produces those words is, quote unquote, the lowest part of who I am. In other words, meaning the most superficial part of who I am. The part that I can share without feeling a loss. And that's why in Sefer Yetzirah, it compares words, or more specifically letters, to stones. Stones are dead. They don't have life of their own. Okay? So you could, and we did this exercise once before. If I take a word, think of a word that's a very meaningful word, a very powerful word, a very emotive word. I don't know, let's choose a word that's very powerful or emotive. Love. There we go. So if somebody had to go over to their child and say to their child, love, 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 it would be completely meaningless, right? Because a word is actually dead. Words don't have vitality. We create vitality using words, but the words themselves don't have vitality. And that's the difference between words and speech. Speech has the power to have an effect on people. And that's why we have the sticks and stones, but words are very powerful ultimately. But the irony of words is that on the one hand, it can have such a great impact on somebody else, while at the same time it can be completely off, like water off a duck's back for me. So the king can say a decree that could affect millions of lives, and all it was one sentence from the king. And it might have even been glib. Didn't necessarily have to be something that he thought about for a long time, because he's the king. So he says it and it automatically has an effect. So what we're seeing is that speech, which is the representation of Malchus, as royalty, which is how Malchus behaves, is a very paradoxical reality. Because on the one hand, from the perspective of the one speaking, this is a relatively superficial state. And from the perspective of the one hearing, this is a potentially transformative experience. That's the irony of words. And that's why very often people say, but I just said something, I didn't mean it. And in the meantime, the person on the other end is completely shattered because of the words that individual used. So there's a huge paradox depending on who you're looking at. If you're looking from the king's perspective, the words are nothing. If you're looking from the audience's perspective, the words can make a whole major difference to their lives. Very important. What's that? Good question. Certainly not as we do. Let's put it that way. But what's most important to us is how Hashem speaks, which is really what we want to get over here. So we want to talk about how we speak and how Hashem speaks, and that's going to be the concept of Malchus, right?
What is the lowest?
Lowest meaning to say it's on the outer part of who I am. It's very simple. If you are alone, do you need to speak? No. Do you need to speak in order to survive? That's a loaded question because some people will say yes. But realistically, objectively, you do not need to speak in order to survive. Therefore, the value that speaking gives us as people is actually relatively superficial. Now, I know there are exceptions, and this is why it's paradoxical. For example, when a person needs to speak about something that's weighing heavily on their heart, it can be very therapeutic to speak. And we know that. So there's a paradox to speaking, but what we've got to distinguish is between the objective assessment of what speech is versus the subjective experience that we have when we speak. So let's do it this way. Just to illustrate the point. If you had a very difficult concept that you were trying to learn and understand, right? How long could you sit focused trying to decode this particular idea before you would feel exhausted?
No.
Yeah, correct. It does depend if you're ADD. But the reality is that using the brain in a very focused, deep way is quite a taxing experience. And while you're doing it, you pretty much can't do anything else. If you're doing it properly, if you're applying your mind properly, that's it. That's where you are. You're completely absorbed, and you really cannot appear in any other environment, and you can't do other things. You can actually be oblivious to what's going on around you. You could be so caught up in your thought process, or this is more than a thought process, in your analysis, in your research, in your study, and you're trying to decode something, that the world essentially disappears from view. That tells you that this is something which is very deep, that this is very personal, this is very close to the core of who I am, and that's why it's taking me almost completely into this experience. Similarly, with an emotion, if a person is experiencing an intense emotion, then at the time of that emotion, firstly, again, they'll be unable to focus on other things. We know this from our own experience, right? When a person is going through a difficult stage, they can't really focus, they can't really respond to people. Everything else feels overwhelming and distracting, and so on and so forth, because there's a lot of drag due to that emotion. So that tells me that emotion is obviously a very personal and very deep part of who I am. But let's jump ahead now. If you're talking, is it possible that you could multitask while you're talking? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. What's that? No, men can as well, they just don't do it well. But the point is that while you're talking, you could be doing something else. It's quite possible. And then, of course, there are different kinds of conversations, so it depends what you're talking about. If, for example, you're giving a speech in front of a big crowd and you have to remember what it is that you're trying to say, you're going to be a lot more focused. That's not because of the words, that's because of the thought that's required in order to present. Whereas if you're just having a casual conversation, so now there's a lot less brain and a lot more just talk. So then it is possible for a person to talk without it being a very taxing experience and without it taking up all of my other resources, so I can actually do other things at the same time. So for example, by the way, going back to whether men or women are better at multitasking, so I know a guy that if you're in the car with him and you're talking to him and it comes time to, at an intersection, then he can't talk because he's got to decide, are we going straight, are we turning, or whatever the case is. Whereas a woman would be able to keep the conversation going, because ultimately conversation is relatively superficial. That's the fact. It's relatively superficial. And some conversations are altogether superficial. Like, for example, those standard greetings that we do. Hello, how are you? Fine, thanks, and you? Fine, thanks, and you? What's happening? Nothing. We really should get together. Okay. Thank you very much. Goya. Okay. So that would be the ultimate version of what speaking is. That speaking could be completely disposable. That you could just say words and the words are completely irrelevant. And here's the next thing about this. How often does this happen to us where somebody says, you said X, and we say, what are you talking about? I never said that. And it's not because we didn't, it's because speaking requires so little engagement that we can actually let words flow without realizing that they've been said. And so we can actually forget the things that we've said shortly after we've said them. That tells you the degree of superficiality of speaking. Not only that, now you're ready for this? Now we're going to make this even more interesting. How many words do you think an average person says on a daily basis? Anybody know? Oh, good question. Man or woman, right? Man or woman. And I once saw a statistic, I don't know if it's accurate, but it was about double for women to men. how many words. But okay, let's leave it at that. So they say the average, depending which research you read, between 15 and 20,000 words a day, something along those lines, right? Okay, so now multiply that out across your whole lifespan. How many words is it that a person says? It's around millions and millions of words. So out of that, every word that you say, or every sentence that you say, or every conversation that you have actually becomes kind of irrelevant. But that's just, what's that?
Are you allocated a certain number?
Okay, that's an interesting question in itself, if you're allocated a certain amount of words or not. I'm yet to find an actual Torah source for that. But and if anybody has one, gesundheit, I haven't just seen it. So anyhow, the point is, so if you look at all of the words that a person is going to say during the course of their lifetime, and then you compare a single conversation to all of those words, it's completely irrelevant. But that's not the point. The point is, think how many words you could have said. In other words, there's a lot of potential that a person has to speak. So my potential to speak is obviously a much deeper part of myself than my actual speaking. Does that make sense?
Indeed.
And in order to speak, I have to have had thoughts. So my words are obviously a lot less meaningful, or a lot less deep, let's use that word, than my thoughts. My thoughts are very personal. And that's why many of my thoughts don't land up in my words, hopefully, right? Because, some people don't have a filter, but ideally the thoughts should remain quite intimate, and the words are what could be shared. So all of that points to the idea that words are quite superficial for the speaker, whereas they could be absolutely meaningful and transformative to the recipient. So you could walk into a place and just greet somebody, just say, a decent hello, and take a minute to find out how they are. For you, that's quite a superficial investment. For that person, it could literally make their day. So that's the paradox of speech. Speech is the connection point between the higher giver and the lower recipient. The king is the speaker who says X, and then the subjects, who are the lower recipients, their whole life is now determined by the thing that he said. So the speaker is incredibly powerful. The listener is quite subjected to the speaker, and that literally means if somebody says something that's offensive, it would be the same kind of concept. If somebody says something that's enlightening, it's the same kind of concept. The speaker is incredibly powerful. The words themselves are superficial relative to the capacity of the speaker, but those words can be completely transformative to the recipient. Therefore, if you had to identify an aspect of Hashem that would be associated with the speaker or the king or Malchus, what role is Hashem playing when he is the speaker? What role is Hashem playing when he is the king? The creator. That's what creation is. Creation is Hashem investing something that by his standards is completely superficial, and yet by our standards makes everything exist. So Malchus equals creator. That's why we consistently refer to Hashem as Melech HaOlam. Not just because we want to say he's the ultimate authority. That's true, obviously. And not just because we want to say that he has all of the power. That is also true. And not only because we want to say that if he's the king, we are his subjects, and therefore we are responsible to serve him, which is also true. But the key we want to illustrate by saying Melech is to appreciate that everything that exists, which to us is so brilliant, so powerful, so complex, so vast, for Hashem was just 10 sentences of creation. So that's what Malchus is teaching us.
Which comes first, thought or speech?
Good question. It's a very good question. So in the human system, thoughts always precede speech. But, this is the paradox of speech, but once you start speaking, it stimulates more and often deeper thoughts. That's why there's an expression the Gemara uses that more than the rich man does for the poor man does for the rich man. Now, most people understand that simply to mean the poor man gets money, the rich man gets a mitzvah, which is valid. But there's another meaning to this as well. The poor man is the recipient in whichever arena it might be. It could be a person who's receiving learning, a person who's receiving support. Always, when you start to give, the paradox of speaking is that speaking, while superficial, stimulates deeper processes, and so becomes a loop where the giver also then becomes the recipient. Now, how that works out in Hashem's terms, we'll have to come back to. But the principle is, and the easiest way to see this is, When you speak something out, it gives you clarity. When you teach something, you understand it better. So there's this weird relationship between the part of me that's the most external, the most superficial, and the capacity that it has to stimulate other deeper parts of myself that I hadn't yet accessed. So it's a very paradoxical reality.
The speech is inspiration. That
It might be, doesn't have to be inspirational.
it clarifies your thoughts.
It helps. One of the mechanisms of speech is to clarify your thoughts. Not the only thing that it does. Sometimes what speech does, it makes something real to you. Until you've said it, it doesn't feel real. There are many benefits to speaking things out. So while speaking is technically a superficial part of who I am, the benefit to the rest of the system is profound. So 1 second. So the king, same thing. Yes, the king is instructing the people just using words, and yet at the same time, that's what makes him a king. Without being able to do that, he doesn't have the capacity to be a king.
That's why we have to now regovern.
That's one of the reasons. There are various reasons, but that's one of the reasons, yes? Kol ma'orer hakavana, that's what it says. So when a person says the davening out loud, that helps the person to focus on their davening, which is exactly this point, right? That when you say the words, it's actually going to deepen your experience. Exactly. 100%. Okay, so with that kind of background, let's go back to the story of David HaMelech, of King David. So King David, the fact that he's the first real king of Israel, and I keep saying that because even though Shaul was a king, we understand that Shaul had a very unique role. This is not dismissive of Shaul. Shaul was one of the greatest tzaddikim in our history. That's why he was held to such a high standard. But he was not intended to be the father of the lineage of kings. And so therefore, he does not represent kings in their deepest sense. By the way, if you want to know for interest's sake, Shaul would represent Bina. Okay, and I'll leave that for something for another conversation. So because David is the person who represents what Malchus is, what a king is all about, and that's why he's always called David HaMelech, therefore, not only does he behave once he's a king in the way that Malchus behaves, but his entire being is a Malchus being. And here we're going to come back to the paradox of Malchus. In the language of Jewish mysticism, we say Malchus leis lei migarmei klum. Malchus leis lei does not have migarmei of its own klum, anything. Malchus is nothing of its own. An easier way to say this is the more famous line that the Gemara uses, ein melech beloi am. There cannot be a king without a people. Now let's understand that, because it's obviously something that we could all relate to, both in the context of being a king, and at this point we could also say king equals leader. So Malchus relates to leadership, not only to a king per se, and speaking. So seeing as speaking is a little bit more relatable because we all speak on a regular basis and we don't necessarily all lead on a regular basis. So because we speak a lot, let's use speaking as to understand these principles that Malchus leis lei migarmei klum, that Malchus has no entity of its own, or ein melech beloi am, that there's no king without a people. So let's understand the two critical things to this. Number one, have you ever been asked to speak about something and you feel like you have nothing to say? Never had that, right? Usually where that happens is at the Shabbos table when somebody says, who's got a Dvar Torah on the parasha? And then everybody has amnesia around the whole table. Now, what does that mean? Did you ever see that fridge magnet that says, before using mouth, ensure that brain is engaged? Ever seen that? Because ultimately, you cannot speak unless you have something to speak about. So that's the first layer of Malchus leis lei migarmei klum. Malchus has nothing of its own. It has to be filled with content from elsewhere. So if I want to speak, then either I've thought about something and I want to share it, or I'm feeling something and I want to share it. So my speaking is actually just a delivery system of my thoughts or my feelings. So the speaking is fundamentally impotent. The speaking is fundamentally dead. But once I plug into it either wisdom or emotion, then speaking becomes worthwhile. Does that make sense? That's why I go back to the idea of just saying love, 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 love. Well, there's no content, there's no emotion, there's no meaning to it, so the words are impotent. So that's the first idea, that Malchus leis le mikarmei klum, that Malchus, which represents either leadership or speaking, has no life of its own. You cannot put somebody up as a leader unless they have leadership skills, unless they're strategic in their thinking, unless they are benevolent and compassionate. There are a whole lot of attributes that they have to have. You can't just plonk somebody down into a particular role and expect that they're going to rise to the occasion. They have to actually have the resources. So, correct. So Malchus means that you don't create a person using a position. You find a position for somebody who deserves that position. That's the first thing that you have to know. Now, the irony is that often the person who's best suited for a position doesn't know it. And we see that right across the experience of Jewish leadership. So Moshe is a great example. Moshe does not believe that he should be the leader. To him, it's clear that Aaron should be the leader. And in his case, what's his issue? He cannot speak. Because to be a leader means you have to speak. And to be able to speak, either you have to have content, which Moshe did have, that was not his problem, but you also have to have the means to deliver that content. That was Moshe's problem. He didn't know how to take his content and make it feasible and relatable for the people. In other words, the fact that Moshe couldn't speak was not just because he had a speech impediment. Whatever his speech impediment was, people always say stutter, but the Torah says kvad peh, which means there were certain letters he couldn't pronounce. The reason that he had a physical ailment is only a reflection of the fact that he had a spiritual restriction. What was the spiritual restriction? People don't think about this, but Moshe Rabbeinu was on such a high level that he didn't know how to speak to ordinary people. That's what it means he couldn't speak. Not that he couldn't enunciate himself. He didn't know how to speak to these people. That would be the equivalent of taking any of us and plonking us down in some primitive tribe that's been found in the middle of the Amazon, and we're trying to have a conversation with them. We don't even know what to talk about, because the things that are so much part of our lives they've never seen or experienced or heard of before, we would not know how to talk to them. So Moshe, who's at such a high spiritual level, doesn't know how to talk to people like us, who, for example, he says, Me'ayin li basar, where am I supposed to find meat for them? It's a weird way to say it, right? When the people were complaining about meat, he should have said, "Why? How's Hashem going to provide meat?" But he didn't doubt Hashem. He knew Hashem could provide meat. He didn't understand why he had to be the delivery man. He did not relate to the need for meat. Just wasn't part of his reality. So he didn't know how to speak to the people. So in order to be able to have Malchus, first you have to have content. You also have to have the capacity to deliver. And then probably the most important thing is you have to have people who are interested in what you have to say. Now, I don't know if you ever heard the reason why we have mechitzas and shuls. You know why we have mechitzas and shuls? Because some rabbis, when they speak, you don't want people to be sleeping, men and women, in the same environment. It's not appropriate. So the point is, I can tell you from experience that trying to speak when nobody's listening is the most it's the most difficult thing in the world. Now, how do I have that experience? Because I'm a parent. So to speak when nobody's listening is completely disheartening, and it's soul destroying. So if a person gets up and they've got a really a well-prepared, very good presentation to give, but the audience is uninterested, then what's going to happen is it's going to be one of their worst presentations. Whereas if a person is speaking and they can see from the audience that there's engagement, that in itself brings out the ability to speak in a way that they hadn't even anticipated. And you often see this if you speak to speakers. They often tell you that they don't even know how it is that they came up with some of the things that they said while they were speaking, because the speaker feeds off the energy of the audience. So this is that paradox of speaking. On the one hand, speaking is a fairly superficial part of who I am, and yet on the other hand, it actually draws out of me strength that I did not know that I had. So you're seeing, what's that? No. Oh, it could stimulate a chokhmah. Yes, it could stimulate a chokhmah. That's true. So the thing is, what you're seeing over here is that what's common throughout Malchus is that Malchus elicits elements of the person that the person did not know that they had. So David HaMelech does not know that he's going to be a leader. It never enters his mind, doesn't enter his father's mind. That's why when Shmuel comes looking for the son of Yishai to appoint him as the king, Yishai doesn't even put David up as a candidate because it just seems so impossible. And yet that's exactly who should be the candidate. Why? Because because he's not a king because of him. He's a king because of what he's able to reflect. Because of his, and here we come back to the point of humility, his extreme humility, that he could literally just be a conduit for the message as opposed to the person who's going to share the message. That's what Malchus is. And by the way, that's what Malchus is compared to the moon. We don't have time for that now, but that's what Malchus compared to the moon. Has no light of its own. It can only reflect light. So because David HaMelech is the ultimate expression of what Malchus is all about, therefore David HaMelech, by definition, cannot live. That means to say, Malchus has no life of its own. So David, who represents Malchus, has no life of his own. By definition, it's not because Hashem doesn't want him to live. It's because the only way that David can live is by getting energy from somewhere external. In the same way as the only way that Malchus could be meaningful is if it is filled with content that comes from elsewhere, either from my intellect or from my emotion. And equally, Malchus has no value until there is an audience. So there has to be something or someone who's interested in David, sees his value, and says, therefore, I'm going to give you the wherewithal that you need in order to become David HaMelech, because that is the secret of how Malchus works. It requires external input. So bringing that down to the king could be the most brilliant person on earth, but if there's no nation who's willing to obey him, he is not a king. And we have places where they keep people who believe that they're Napoleon and other such people, because to imagine that you're a king without having a following, you can never be a king. Just one more interesting point. You can never be the king over your biological family, because by definition, those who give you the role of king have to have no affiliation to you. There must be no natural connection. If there's a natural connection, how can you be their king? You're part of their blood. In order to be their king, there has to be distance. Therefore, when Hashem creates the world, how does he create the world? In such a way that we feel independent. If we didn't feel independent, that's why the angels don't really have the capacity to make Hashem a king, because they're like part of the family. They feel close. Until you have a sense of independence, until you have a sense of feeling that you are distant from the king, you cannot give the king that authority. You cannot give the king that leadership power by showing obedience. You're not obedient, or you should never be obedient, to biological family. That should be a love-based relationship. Even though the Torah talks about kibbud av va'em and all that kind of thing, it's not obedience in the servant-subject way, whereas to a king, it is. So what that means is that our relationship with Hashem, although we are Hashem's children, right? At the end of the day, that's what we are. We are Hashem's children. But what is the primary way that we create our relationship with Hashem? Obedience. We do the mitzvahs, and it's specifically including mitzvahs that don't make logical sense to us, right? Which is a very big part of how we show our obedience to Hashem. That's what makes Hashem present in our lives. He becomes our leader. He becomes Malkeinu, our king. He becomes part of our lives. And seeing as David was the original king, who would then be the ultimate version of David? Mashiach, right? Mashiach is, we call him Mashiach ben David, because not just because Mashiach is from the lineage of David, but because Mashiach has to effectively replicate what David is all about, which is the ultimate state of Malchus. Therefore, Mashiach cannot come. Mashiach has to be brought. In other words, until we are in a position that we're willing to accept the role or the authority of Mashiach as a king, the Rambam says clearly that he has to be a king and that he has to Yachov Kol Yisrael, he has to literally coerce us to do certain things. Until we are willing to accept Mashiach's role, Mashiach cannot manifest, because by definition, Mashiach is Malchus. So to wrap up, Malchus represents Hashem as creator. That tells us that the entire creation, as impressive as it is for us, from Hashem's perspective, is the most superficial part of his investment. Yet, because of that paradoxical relationship between the audience and the speaker, or between the people and their king, by us doing what Hashem wants in this world, that stimulates far deeper input from Hashem into our world. In other words, he's empowered us to have the ability to be able to bring more godliness into the world by showing our obedience, by doing Torah and mitzvahs. On a human level, Malchus is our ability to share with others, specifically to share through speaking. And while that is something which requires so little of us, at the same time, it could be so enriching to us, both in terms of giving us clarity and helping us to work through things, and in terms of being able to draw on deeper parts of ourselves that are only stimulated once we start speaking.
So what I want to say that Adam, by giving him those 70 years, almost that's what was the catalyst, the independence.
So Adam to, correct. So Adam to David is the equivalent of your intellect giving you something to talk about. That's kind of the relationship. Correct. Correct. And Adam is one of the greatest neshamas that ever lived, and therefore he has the capacity to do so. Exactly.
So what I wanted to say, and so now, of course, we actually